¿Qué tal a todos? ¿Cómo están? Vamos checando el audio mientras llega Jeff. Alberto Núñez. Hey there, brother. Here in the Mexican time. There you go.
All right,
Hi, Jeff. How are you doing?
good. Just I guess I'm not used to the technology. I had to figure out what button to hit to get this to work.
It's quite simple once you figure it out, but I still, I still screw up from time to time, so don't worry.
I'm here, man. Yeah, I'm live.
First and foremost, huge pleasure, huge honor. You don't know the big influence you have on a lot of us here in Mexico. We talked fairly recently on a podcast we have with a couple friends with Alberto Nunez,
Okay.
your coworker, and to me it blows my mind to be speaking to you now. So huge thank you, huge pleasure. And how
Right
you
on.
been? What are you
Good.
currently doing? What are your current goals in regards to bodybuilding?
Yeah, well, it's my honor to be on. I appreciate you having me. And yeah, we're just like two guys just lifting weights, man. So it's yeah, really not a big deal for me. So yeah, right now I'm just goal wise, just getting ready for some shows. So trying
Right.
to slowly but surely get myself into shape. I just committed yesterday to a guest posing in at the end of towards the end of August. So I have to get ready for that. So yeah, I was kind of like on the fence with it because I wasn't sure if I was going to be ready in time. But
Right.
it's kind of one of those like if I don't commit, then it's not going to nudge me. So I made the commitment. Now I have to put the work in. So we're looking forward to it.
Awesome. I remember I think it was the last time you were in Mexico that you were training not weights. I don't know how you in Spanish
We're doing a
water
seminar.
jugs. I think.
Oh yeah.
I
We're
remember
down
that.
in down there vacationing. So
Yeah. Right.
we were
Yeah.
there for a week, and the gym that was supposed to train, it was an Airbnb, and the guy that we were renting from said there was a gym, but he didn't tell us
Sure.
we had to pay for guest passes, and it was kind of expensive. So and it was like a big ordeal, a big hassle to try to get these guest passes. So when I first got to the Airbnb, looked in the kitchen, I saw this big water jug. I'm like, that'll work. I'll just fill it with
Yeah.
water and do the same movement patterns.
Yeah. It
And
blew my
just
mind. It blew my mind because once you see someone with a career like yours, spanning 30, 33 years training, if I'm correct.
this is my 36th.
36 years and two pro cards, tons of contests. I mean, that kind of lets me know that bodybuilding can be at par with a healthy lifestyle, which is why I wanted and the topic at hand that I wanted to discuss with you. And if it's okay with you, I wanted to start. I think it's fairly cliche to start there, but how do you get into bodybuilding, into weightlifting, and specifically because at least here in Mexico, it's always present the pharmacological side of bodybuilding that almost everybody goes down that route. And
Hmm.
one thing that I truly admire is in your long spanning career, how did you make that decision to stay natural and knowing that maybe we're not going to be like 100 and something kilo guys, but still accepting that and still being able to train and to progress, right? So
Right.
if you're okay, can we begin by that? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I started in 1986. Kind of like the old story of like the plastic weights, the cement-filled plastic weights. So I started there in my bedroom every day, and I started training not because I wanted to like get big or try to impress girls or anything like that. It was more so like my home life wasn't all that great at that time. It was a big transition for me because my parents got divorced, my mom remarried, so going into a new home with a stepfather and just a big transition. So that was kind of my escape was to go in my room every day after school and just go lift these plastic weights. And, before you know it, these little muscles started to pop up and, it was intriguing. So I just kept at it. And as far as the competitive side of bodybuilding, I really didn't venture into that early on. Had no goal of competing at all. It was just more like, yeah, I'm just trying to escape home life a little bit. And then I was like, okay, I like this muscle thing. I can see things going, so I'm going to keep doing it. And it wasn't until the early 90s where I started to get on stage and compete. But I mean, if we fast, I mean, there's a lot to cover here, but if I fast forward it more towards the late 90s, that's where I kind of learned about like natural bodybuilding. Because up until that point, we had no clue because there was no internet. So I
Sure.
don't know what shows are, like what are natural shows, what are non-natural shows. All the shows I was doing up to that point were non-tested. So I was going against guys that were, doing steroids and that type of thing. But as far as my background and how I was raised by my parents, it was just basically, say no to drugs, don't smoke, don't drink. Even though my parents smoked, they still would say don't smoke, And I just think being around it as a young child, like my mom would like literally kill me in the car. She would have the windows rolled all the way up while she's smoking, and I'm like, Mom, roll the windows down. It's so just it
But
was in a sense I was kind of repulsed by it. So it's just kind of how I was raised not to, go down those types of routes. So that kind of just kept me on the natural side of things. And then I saw, pretty good development, just from what I was doing. And I wasn't like 100%, you know, doing things ideally, but I was still making some improvements. So as long as I was seeing those slight improvements, it kind of kept me, content, kept me happy. And, some of the shows that I did do, I would see some of the guys that were using, and I was like, they're not all that impressive. It's like, yeah, you're big, but to me, some of them lack symmetry, they lack conditioning, they didn't know pose well. And I'm like, well, there's all these other aspects of bodybuilding that I can improve on without just focusing solely on size.
totally.
So yeah, it's kind of just some of the earlier beginnings for me. And once I learned about natural bodybuilding, I was like, oh, okay, now there's this whole other playing field that's a little more even for me that I can excel in. And there was a point in time where, I kind of stopped looking at the IFBB guys because it was in the early 90s, mid 90s, late 90s. I was like looking at Dorian Yates, those type guys. And yeah, it's inspiring, to see these guys work hard and they're developing these huge, amazing physiques. But at the same time, it comes to a realization like I'm not ever going to go that route. And it's not really, if you think about it, it's like I'm looking up to these guys, but I'm never going to even come close to that level unless I do what they're doing. And I'm not willing to do that. I didn't want to do that. That's just not me. So I realized like, okay, I need to actually look at the guys that I can compete
Sure.
against. And so that's where I was like, okay, I'm putting all my attention more towards the natural bodybuilding side of things. And once I kind of had that perspective and that reality and that clarity, then I had an approach like, okay, now this is what I need to do to further myself in that realm.
And that really resonates because in the 90s, you would see in the magazines, Flex magazine, Muscle Mag, all these monsters, Dorian included. You would see, what's his name? One bodybuilder that did extreme bulks. I don't remember, Lee Priest. Lee Priest.
Yeah.
So me too. That's what I was exposed to when I began training at a gym. I didn't know that there existed natural and non-natural bodybuilding. I just did it, and that also resonates mostly to escape situations, mostly to feel better about yourself, not just to be the biggest guy in the room, not to impress girls, and that's never been for me also. And I identify with you too. That's never been the case. Never, it's never been like, let me do this to impress others. And I think that's one of the most positive aspects we can extrapolate from bodybuilding. But uh, building from there, I wanted to ask you, how has your experience changed in regards to gym culture from your beginnings to nowadays? Because if you, well, you're in 3D MJ, you work with the man himself, Eric Helms, evidence-based, let's say, the epitome of evidence-based. How has gym culture in your experience changed from your beginnings to nowadays? Because nowadays you kind of have this camp of evidence-based guys, and you have the old school guys that train balls to the wall, that do extreme balls, that do extreme cuts, always extreme, more based on culture than based on evidence on better decision making.
Hmm. Yeah, early on, like I said, early on, I started out in my room, kind of by myself, plastic weights, and then I got into
Me too, man.
lifting in high school. So I was doing it there, but at my high school, there really wasn't that many guys that were like lifting for like aesthetics. It was more like,
Right.
hey, we're lifting for football or we're lifting for some sport or something like that. So I was like the only guy kind of in the high school gym that was like, hey, I'm doing this bodybuilding type style thing. And then from there, I got into commercial gyms. So back in the 90s, it was like more about like hardcore, like you said, like the people in the gym. Back then you had guys in wearing their tight striped pants with their tank tops, the gold
The crazy,
chains.
crazy colors, yeah.
Yeah, man, like one guy who looked like Ronald McDonald, the red and yellow stripes. It's like, so, but I wasn't like that. I was more like, hey, I just wear some sweats, and just wear a sweatshirt or something like that, and kind of just focused on myself. But my personality just, I don't really gravitate towards a lot of people. I'm kind of like more of a hermit. So I was kind of
Sure.
doing my own thing. And that was, in a sense, kind of a good and a bad. Had pros and cons to it because the pros would be like, okay, I'm kind of just focusing on myself and not worried about what that guy over there is doing or what that guy is doing. And now online, it's like you see people comparing themselves to other people all the time, and it drives a lot of stress and insecurities around that. So the good thing about me being kind of a loner in the gym was like I was just focused on myself. The negative would be is that I kind of in a sense I wasn't giving myself a good opportunity to learn because I wasn't engaging with other people. So that kind of held me back a little bit. And then, through the years, it was more or less like that for quite a while. And then I got a home gym, in 2004. So 2004 up to now, I've been in a home gym. So I
Right.
really haven't been exposed to too much gym culture now, as far as commercial gym culture. So I can't really talk too much about that. So
But have you seen maybe a change through social media in that culture? Because from 2004, maybe it was forums, maybe it was things like that, and nowadays it's more like every day you see stories, you see people right there what they're doing, like an Instagram live stream. Do you think it's been a perceivable change in how we approach to bodybuilding?
I think the knowledge has improved vastly now because, like you mentioned, the evidence base and the research that's out there. Like, obviously, we're getting better at doing things, but there's still like the bro life now, right? Like, still
Mhm.
see but it's the same thing back then. Even before the internet, you still had the gym bros. You still had other people that were probably a little bit more methodical with the approach. It's just everything is more out in the open now because of the internet. So I don't think as much changed as far as that is concerned, but I think the sport is definitely evolved. And you even see some of the guys now on the IFBB side. I mean, there's some evidence-based people there as well that are doing
Yeah,
things a lot wiser. So it's like with anything in life, like the more you're exposed to the information and the knowledge, like we just evolve and get better over time. But yeah, there are camps. Like there's camps. You got hey, the clean eating camp. You got the flexible dieting camp. You got the high
for
volume
sure.
camp, the low volume camp. Like you have all these camps, all these little cliques. And that was me in the early stages of my career. Like, hey, I'm doing this low volume, high intensity thing. And my identity was evolved around that. And it's almost like when you're in something so deep like that, you get protective of it. So if anybody starts to say, hey, maybe you should do high volume instead of that low volume stuff, and then you kind of just you put walls up and you defend it. And that's how you kind of hold yourself back because you're not willing to learn other ways of doing things. So I just learned over the years, like all these camps might have some validity to them, but what's really important is that you don't get sucked into a vacuum. You're like, okay, maybe I can take a little piece of that, and create my own and make my own path a little bit better because of all that.
Right. And I think that's really interesting because specifically with the content that 3D provides, to me at least, and I know for a lot of people, it's a game changer more specifically to not be a part of a set culture of an ideology, whether it is Mike Mansor's heavy duty, if it's intermittent fasting, if it is only high volume. It's more of, okay, let's check out what's the evidence on a given topic, and then with our personal experience, take better decisions. So I wanted to ask you, what is your stance, or how do you define for yourself an evidence-based practice?
I would define it
Sure. Yeah, I'm really interested in that because
like
3DMJ, it's
like
almost a
some people
synonym.
look at evidence base or the research and they kind of look externally, like, right? You're looking externally at it. And especially if you don't have as much experience, you're kind of just relying on that to kind of guide you. And you try to, in a sense, pattern everything you're doing based off of that.
Yeah.
But for myself, because I've been doing this for so long, I'll look at that and go, okay, does it make sense? Can I actually apply that? So I've learned to kind of use a little of both, right? Okay, let me look at the research, but also let me look at my history, and and I'll try to kind of mesh the two so things are practical, enjoyable, sustainable. And of course, that's what we're trying to talk about now is longevity. That's a part of longevity is making sure that what you're doing, you're able to adhere to it, you're sustaining it, but you're enjoying it. Because if you don't enjoy something, I don't care what kind of research is out there. They can say, "Hey Jeff, if 5 sets of curls doing 10 reps at one rep in reserve is the most
Sure.
optimal way for to grow your biceps." But if I don't like, if I can't adhere to that, or I just don't enjoy it fully, chances are I'm not going to follow it for too long.
Right. And I think that's where we, myself included, kind of missed the boat. At least at my first exposure to what evidence-based was, that, okay, if you don't do like this paper says, you're a dumbass. You're not in current research and whatever. But I think the more I follow people like yourself, and I follow your training posts and all the podcasts that you do with 3DMJ and several others, the more I'm beginning to understand differently all the evidence-based approach that yes, we may start from whatever paper says, a meta-analysis, whatever, analyze that said paper, but also put it in par with experience, with adherence, and also with what someone can do in the long run, specifically in bodybuilding and also in natural bodybuilding, which we know as years go by, it gets harder and harder to squeeze little bit of gain, and the risk reward ratio kind of gets worse. That maybe like I have a quote from Alberto that one rep might break you, but might not build you. Something along those lines that
Yeah,
kind of
one rep
resonated.
won't make you, but one rep can
That
break you. Yeah.
that very same one, and it blew my mind because, well, that's totally true. And if I want to stay in this in the long run, if I want to make it a part of a healthy lifestyle, I can begin to look at things differently.
Hmm.
And also in regards to evidence based, because I'm sure you remember there was this volume wars a couple of years back, that the more you do, the more hypertrophy,
Yep.
and there I was. Of course, I was doing a ton of sets, feeling fatigued, feeling awful. But hey, evidence based says I need to do a ton of sets,
Oh,
and
I mean, it was almost on a daily basis that I would just get bombed with DMs and go, your volume is so low, your volume is so low. Like it was just constant. And it was a little frustrating on my part, to be flooded with that. But I'm like thinking in my head, like, I've been training for like over 30 years. I mean, that's a ton of volume, you think about it. Whether I do 3 sets for curls or I do five, you add it up over 30 years. I mean, that is a ton more volume. So the people that are kind of inquiring about my volume, why is it so low? The majority of them are like in their 20s, or maybe at the very oldest in their late early 30s. It's like I have so much more training age on them. Volume is just super, super high. But getting back to your evidence-based question, like you can be evidence-based just on your own trial and error. If you're like keeping your variables nice and controlled, they're pretty tight. Like you can run certain thing a certain amount of time, nice and tight, controlled, change something and then run that very controlled, very tight, and just take your own data, your own assessments. That's evidence-based because you'll see your results
totally.
on that. So, you don't necessarily need to like just solely look at, what the research is saying and take it as holy grail. Because you might be one of those people that fall a little bit on the outside of their realms.
Totally. Yeah, man, it's so nice to talk to you about these things because it's been changing my perspective on bodybuilding for a while now. And I think it can begin to be a better part of our lives. And that's the next topic I wanted to discuss with you. Have you had bad experiences with bodybuilding that lessens your quality of life? Because at least for me, it's been the case when I was starting my career. I remember that was my only worry to get my meals, to get my training. If I was super stressful or whatever, I still would get my meals. I would still sacrifice relationships, sacrifice going out with people because, hey, I'm training. I have to do this seriously because I'm a bodybuilder, right? I'm hardcore. I'm not like you weak-minded people. Maybe I didn't say it out loud, but in my head, that was the story I was telling myself. How has been your experience over 30 something years and nowadays, how is your relationship with your own personal bodybuilding, Jeff?
I think I'm a much better bodybuilder in my 40s and now 50s than I was in my 20s and 30s. As far as like just having a really good relationship with bodybuilding in life. Because life quality in my 20s and 30s, at least I thought my life quality was good because I was so focused and obsessed on the bodybuilding side of things. Like it was too high of a priority. So, as far as like relationships, with ex-wife, with family members,
Yeah,
even with work, not putting as much focus into work as maybe I should have been. Just a lot of that kind of was not as good as it could have been. And it's the one thing I have like regrets on looking back is that I could have been a far better human, you know. In bodybuilding, I would say bodybuilding isn't the reason. It's more so how I approached bodybuilding is the reason why like the human side kind of slipped down. So, I've kind of just learned that when your life outside the gym is a little bit more in order, like
sure.
you have your priorities in order, what you do in the gym is just easier to come by. Like there's not as much stress there. I don't know if about you, but I've had some workouts where I'm like, I know I should be doing something else. I should be taking care of something else, but I'm
Totally.
doing this now. And you have in the back of your head like a little bit of that anxiety and stress. So sometimes you might like get halfway through a workout and then the other half, the back half, you're like, I'm in a rush because I have to hurry up and get out to do the other thing. But if you would take care of the other stuff first, then there's a lot less stress outside the gym. So therefore, when you're in the gym, you're a little bit more at peace. So now, because I prioritize my family first, my wife, my athletes, like that always comes first before my training. So when I do get into the gym, I know I have everything taken care of. So when I am in the gym for an hour, hour and a half, that's my time to just really enjoy the training. Whether I have like really good workouts, like I'm hitting a PR, or it's just an average workout, or even a shitty workout, I'm just like, okay, it's a good day because one, I'm in the gym doing what I love to do, and I have all my priorities in order, so I can appreciate what I'm actually doing a lot more.
Yeah, that's so awesome to hear because yeah, I recall several workouts when the back of my head was like, but I need to do this and I postponed that because I wanted to train and I need to get a PR because well, I'm hardcore, right? But seeing your stories and also a concept that I wanted to ask you about is pennies in the bank, putting pennies in the bank. And some things, like you said, some days, like you said, it's shitty workouts, but those still count. And if you don't get PRs, it still counts. And if you don't get, let's say, 4 or 5 in deadlift for 8 reps because last workout you did 7, it's a total failure. That's not that's not a
Oh
sustainable
man,
way to look at bodybuilding because it's like that transition, that you begin to log your workouts, and that also becomes maybe negative for some people. That you need to beat the logbook, and that's more stress
yeah.
on top of all the stress you have.
Oh my
So,
gosh, yeah. I've had those workouts where it's like you miss your target and you think it's the
yeah,
end of the world. You're pissed off the rest of the day, you're upset, you're stressing. It's like if you think about it, like what really gave me a lot of clarity is when I thought about like my muscle has no idea what the number is at the end of the bar or how many reps I'm actually doing. Like it has no concept of numbers, but it knows what it feels. So you can actually get more stimulus with hitting less load or less reps than you did, let's say, the week prior, if it was probably a lot harder because the intensity is magnified, right? Like you're fatigued, so you can't really get as many reps in there, but your muscle is working just as hard, if not harder, to get the weight you're working with up and the reps you're getting up. So no doubt you're recruiting like all muscle fiber. So you're going to get a stimulus regardless. And you're still training, so you're still moving yourself forward. It'd only be a red flag if, let's say, every single training session, you're like the numbers are going down, numbers are going, yeah, that's a red
Totally.
flag. But if it's like once in a blue moon, you're missing some targets, it's like chances are you're still progressing. I'm speaking of like the bodybuilding side of things, not powerlifting, but listen, hypertrophy style training.
Totally. And I think that's one of the concepts where evidence may come in handy. I talked a while back with Brian Miner, and one thing that it's pretty clear nowadays for me is that the overload is a threshold. It's a range. It's not a fixed number. And also seeing your training, seeing what you share with in your own personal account, it's even more clear because it's not a linear relationship. If you've been training for more than 30 years, the way I used to see it, by then I would be squatting 700 pounds for reps, no? But it's not like that. It's maybe you're squatting 315 because you want to protect your back, because you had an injury, because whatever the case may be, it doesn't need to be that linear relationship. And I also recall a couple of days back, I think maybe weeks, something no, it was Alberto that shared in a couple stories that he was deadlifting and wanting to go up in weight. And I think he shared a conversation
Yeah, yeah,
from the two of you that you said, hey, the risk reward from going up in weight at this point in your career might not be worth it. And man, you don't know how much that content influenced me. And I know a lot of people, a lot of friends that
yeah,
also train. And
yeah.
that's if I
I
wanted to, no,
Yeah,
go ahead.
he's a very confident bodybuilder, you know, and I know him well enough that he's competitive, so he wants to drive those lifts up,
Sure.
so I watch his YouTube videos. I'm like, let me watch it, and I watched that, and I'm like, he's lifting a lot of weight right now, like that's a ton of weight, and that's an RDL, and he's prepping. So you have to think about like where he's at in the context, right? Like if he's off season, he's well fed, there's a decent amount of body fat there, he's pliable, leverages are good. Yeah, go for it. Go ahead and try to push your numbers up because you're in an environment to do it. But now it's like, okay, you're in a deficit, you're getting leaner, and from you going from 4 plates up to 455 or whatever he was wanting to do, I'm like, it's not like he's going to all of a sudden put more muscle on his hamstrings or his glutes or anything by jacking the load up and trying to pursue these numbers in a deficit, especially with the amount of age that he's been training, right? He's got like 20 years or so of training age under his belt. So it's not like he's going to see a whole lot by creeping his numbers up. So I'm like, hey, if you just stay here, this is elite level load on an
Yeah.
RDL.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like if you just stay here, that muscle is not going anywhere, and you're just basically keeping your risk a little bit lower, from possibly, getting some aches and pains. So yeah, I'm honored that he actually listened to it and he's following through with it.
Yeah, I think you're, for a lot of people, the voice of reason in bodybuilding, which is funny because Alberto himself, the quote that we cited earlier, that one rep can break you, Alberto himself finds himself in that position. So I think,
That
like
shows
you,
the sign of his maturity as a
right,
lifter, right? As someone who's willing to like take advice and listen to other people and think about it, analyze it, and in a sense, make good decisions. Now, maybe Alberto of 20 years ago or Jeff of 20 years ago would have been like, that guy don't know what he's talking about. I'm gonna do my 450. I'm gonna get it. Yeah, so that's a part of longevity, right? It's a part of sign of
sure,
maturity, as a lifter. Because as a natural bodybuilder, I mean, you can look around and see the Marshall Johnsons of the world, Dave Gooden. These are some names if you look up. These are
Yeah,
guys that had careers in their 50s on high level. So this is a long game. It's not a sprint. So if you have that mentality of like, hey, I'm gonna progress for years, and I'm not gonna stress on like trying to force progress to come. Just think of where your anxiety levels would be with the long game approach. Like you would be a little more poised, a little more chill. So it gives you a little more opportunity to enjoy what you're doing versus always being stressed and being anxious about your progress.
totally. And one thing that comes to mind is the external influence of social media, because maybe content creators, well, we want to see big numbers, we want to see big changes, we want to see big everything. And bodybuilding doesn't lend itself to that, really. Bodybuilding might be repetitive, maybe sometimes you need to lighten the load. That that's not really sexy, right? So how do you personally, Jeff, handle that? Because well, you have a lot of followers, you have a lot of people that follow your advice, and how can you, maybe at this point in your career it's not so much the case, but how can, or what advice can you give to someone that's fighting the voices in your heads to go up, to show that we are the man, when bodybuilding it's really not like that?
It's a it's probably the most boring sport out there because it's not a fast moving sport. It's not like
Totally.
I just did my upper body session today. All of a sudden, like tomorrow, I'm like I got 20-inch arms. It just doesn't happen that way. And a lot of times when we're following content, I think there's too much content out there, to be honest with you. And I think there's just so many people out there that want to be relevant. They want to be like, whether they're coaches or influencers or whatever. So they have to try to stay relevant. So they're just going to flood you with content because they want the engagement, they want the likes. So it's hard because you're seeing that if you're scrolling your feed, I mean you're just being bombarded with all these things, and sometimes it's conflicting information because I might say one thing, you might say something else. So the person that's consuming that's like, who's right? What do I do?
Right. Totally.
So the beauty of me growing up, back in the 80s and 90s was that I didn't get exposed to all that. So I was able to kind of see like what was actually working and not working for myself. The only thing was is because I wasn't exposed to a lot of information, I didn't know how to assess it and adjust that much. So my advice would be like if you're just one who's like confused by so much content, like find someone who's really credible, you can trustworthy, where maybe you can hire him as a coach just to kind of, because that's what I do as a coach is I try to get someone like who happens to be, let's say, looking at so many different pieces of information. I create a structure and I put him here, like here, this is your structure. Let's pay attention to what you're doing. Let's assess it and let's make adjustments based off of your own evidence.
Yeah.
And that's probably the best way that I can kind of describe. It's like probably the best advice I can give someone who's like very conflicted with so much content out there and so much information out there. But yeah, I know it's challenging for some people because it's social media is just so fast paced. Like you see my posts, like I'll write a long caption on my training, and
Sure.
I don't tell you, hey, this is how you guys need to do this. This is what I do, this is why I do it, and I let you come to your own conclusions, or maybe you're like, hey, that kind of makes sense, doesn't make sense. Maybe I can implement that. Let's see how it works. So I don't really say, hey, this is something you should be doing because it may or may not. So I really try
Totally.
not to I try not to influence or to bias people one way or another.
Totally. And like you said, bodybuilding it's truly it's really boring, but a lot of a lot of things can be learned from the sport and can extrapolate to several other aspects of your life. So a little bit of a segue, I wanted to ask you, how has your training changed over the years? And how's your approach to training nowadays, and specifically in a contest prep? How maybe Jeff from now, what would be the difference in his training from Jeff 10 years ago? Has there really been a change, and what has impulsed the change?
I just think from a big picture perspective, like back when I first started, I really didn't know what I was doing. But my first introduction to structured training was Mike Mintzer's HIT.
Right.
So the good thing about it was it gave me structure. So that was probably the biggest positive out of it. The other thing would be like because of the intensity, I worked hard and I seen results because of the effort. But it also taught me to be closed-minded because I saw really good gains with it initially,
Mhm.
but it closed my mind to other ways of training. Because again, it was almost like you get like in this cult and you start defending the method. So I identified with it. It was like part of my identity. So for a lot of years, I just had walls up to other ideas. But looking in hindsight, hindsight's always 2020 because when you look back in hindsight, you have a lot more clarity. So back then, the reason it worked so well was because of the phase prior to that. I was underfed and training too much. So I didn't really see good gains because of that. Well, once I started doing the hit, I was basically starting to overeat, like putting myself in a surplus. So all of
Right.
a sudden I made these gains. So now when I look in hindsight, I go, was it really the hit training was the sole reason why I made those gains? Or was it just the fact that I was training hard with effort and I was well fed? So the question I have now is, would I have made similar gains or more gains doing more volume and having a lot more food there? I would say if someone like really pressed me for an answer, I would say both ways probably would have been about the same.
Right.
And that's the thing I've noticed over the years in my training, whether I've gone low volume, high intensity, or I've added more volume, lower intensities, my results are very similar across the board. Um, and that's kind of the biggest thing I've kind of learned over the years is that how to control or balance out supply and demand. So whether, we're doing more volume, less volume, or whatever, if you're trying to put muscle on, you want to have the environment to do that. So you want to be well fed, you want to have good sleep, hydration, that type of thing. So I don't care if you have the most optimal program on paper. If you're not feeling it, you're not sleeping well, you're not controlling stress levels, you're not staying hydrated, it's going to be very hard for you to make gains.
Right.
So,
And I
in a nutshell, fast forward to now. So I use a lot of different approaches to training depending on the context I'm dealing with at hand. So like right now, like you said, I'm contest prepping. So, my volume can't be like I can't ramp volume up too much because I only have so much recovery ability, because I'm in a deficit. So
sure.
I can't go, okay, this week I'm going to do 2 sets and then 3 weeks later I'm going to do 5 sets. Chances are, it's 3 weeks later in a deficit. So I'm going to be lighter in weight, possibly food might be even lower. So I don't have enough supply there to support that type of training. So a lot of it is based off of the context, like, okay, how I'm feeling as well. Like, I feel good today. Okay, maybe I can do a little more training. I don't feel as good. Let's back training off. So I use different approaches. Yesterday, just for example, I used HIT because I did 2 sets and just went closer to
All out.
failure, all
Right.
out, went closer to failure. And, it wasn't overly taxing because I only did 2 sets in exercise. And I only did, I think, four, so like 8 sets total in the whole session. So, and I feel fine today. If I would have done 4 or 5 sets and, even if the intensity was a little lower, I might feel a little more wiped out. So just I base things just on the context at hand using what I've learned over the last 30 plus years with training
Right.
approaches. And a lot of that has to do with evidence based too, because I take principles. Like if you take the principles from evidence base,
Totally.
yeah, you realize like you don't have to be as rigid with things. Like I don't have to like last week I hit 8 reps with a load. This week I have to hit 9, but hey, it's okay if I hit 8 again.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Muscle ain't going nowhere. Yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of us think of evidence-based like something really square, like it has to be this way. But it's the total opposite. It gives you a range. It gives you a principles. It doesn't give you exact rules. That's the I think for me the most wonderful thing about it and mixing it with experience. I wanted to ask you, Jeff, the concept like you mentioned, what do you exactly mean by supply and demand in regards to your own bodybuilding?
Okay, so the way I look at that is your demand is the training demand.
Mm,
If you happen to be doing cardio, that's a demand. Your step count, that's a demand. life itself is a demand, like work, school,
Sure,
dealing
sure.
with family relationships, that type of thing. It could all can be demands, all can be stressors, right? The supply is your food level, your sleep, your rest days. That's basically your supply. So if your
Nice.
demand is outpacing your supply and you're trying to build muscle, that ain't gonna happen, right? So your supply has to be higher than the demand. You don't want it too high because otherwise you start getting fluffy and soft and that. And then of course people don't like that. They're like, okay, let me do this, and now they're
Yeah,
here.
right.
And then you always get like that's always like the main question I always get when I first start working with them. What do I do? Do I bulk or cut? Well, most people's history is this, right? They're like this all over the place, right? So they gain too much weight, they get soft. I'm going to go into a deficit, then they get too severe with the deficit. They lose body fat, but they also lost the muscle they did gain in the bulk. So they're never in a really good place. And if you think about your behaviors with this, like think about how you execute your protocols when you're doing this. Streams, like one way to the other. So you try to get more of this. So your supply, if you're trying to gain muscle, a little bit higher demand. When you're in a deficit, the demand is just slightly above supply. But you don't
Uh,
always want to have to be in the deficit the entire time. It's like refeed, diet breaks. So that
all
way
right.
you get to recharge your batteries a little bit. You get your training to be a little bit better. You know, you recharge those batteries, get better recovery, better performance. On the real life perspective, like you're not going to be an asshole the whole time because you have a little more food at times, right? So, you know, I don't know about you, but my wife likes to go out for dinner every once in a while and have a glass of wine. So, you know, I'm not going to an 8 month prep, you know, and just being an asshole for 8 months. That's, I mean, yeah. So what you don't see online is you don't see behind closed doors. You just see what someone's going to show you. Like, hey, I made
Yeah.
progress this week. Look at my abs. Everything's great, but you don't see what happens behind closed door, you know?
Man, I find that super interesting. We've discussed this with a couple of friends a lot of times. Social media. Social media always blows my mind because we only see that, right? We only see the highlights. We only see the striations. We only see the apps. We only see the PRs. But hey, what happened that day? What happened with your relationships? What happened with your family? What happened with your work? What happened with all the real life that's not on social media? And that's something that I'm really thankful that you share with people in your account. That it's not like that. It doesn't have to be like that. You don't need to sacrifice your life for maybe a fake life in social media, but for bodybuilding itself, that bodybuilding can be a part and not your whole life experience. And that doesn't mean that you cannot be the best bodybuilder that you can strive for.
Yeah. There's at times where, yeah, you got to sacrifice a little bit. So you might say, okay, you know what? I have to tell my wife, all right, this weekend I can't do these things. I got to stay on point, got to make the progress. But it's a conversation ahead of time. It's like, this is what I need to do. This is the reason why. So
Mm.
there's a little bit more understanding from her of what I need to do. But at the same time, it doesn't give me the right to be overly obsessive with the bodybuilding side of things and ignore priorities or ignore, you know, her emotions, her feelings. Like you still have to be engaged with that, even though you're kind of sacrificing. But I don't think it's kind of like you see online too, right? You have to. There's no way you can get shredded again on bodybuilding. You have to sacrifice, right? Like there's just no way you can be balanced. And people
That's
will
the
say there's no
narrative.
such
Yeah.
thing as balance. Like it's kind of like the hardcore bro who eats chicken, brown rice, and broccoli, and the flexible dieter who's eating nothing but Pop Tarts, right? It's like this
Right.
extremism. It's like why can't it be a sliding scale? Like, why can't at times you're like, yes, I am that hardcore bodybuilder. But no, there's other times where I'm going to slide the scale this way. Go, no, I'm going to be more flexible because of X, Y, Z. And there's a reason I'm
Totally.
still competing at 51, right? I'm soon to be 51. It's because I learned how to do this, the balance, the sliding scale, like more balance, more sacrifice. If I was like the hardcore bodybuilder that I was in my 20s, one, I would probably not be bodybuilding anymore, or two, I would probably be going through two divorces instead of one. So at
Right.
the end of the day, I'm like, I don't want to hold up my. Oh, I went to WBF Worlds. I got third place. You know, I did really well, top three in the world. And then the next day, you know, you wake up and there's no one there supporting you. You have no one there to
Oh
share
man.
it with. So
Man,
sometimes as a coach, I've seen a lot on the other side and with myself. So I know a lot of that isn't projected to the real world. So just people who might be listening might be going, yeah, I kind of relate to what he's kind of saying because the fact is we're human. We're not these robots, hardcore robots that some bodybuilders like try to make it seem. They perceive that, but it's that's not really the case.
man, that hit hard, let me tell you. Because yeah, I know a lot of people that have been through that experience, not to that extent, but I sacrificed maybe more than what it needed to be sacrificed in regards to family meetings, in regards to friend meetings, in regards to personal relationships, and it hits home. It hits home hard. So I don't want to take much of your time anymore, Jeff. The last thing I wanted to ask you to make honor to the title of the conversation, what would be your keys for longevity in bodybuilding? What have you learned over the past 30 something years training that now you can maybe point out to people, to novice bodybuilders, so that we, myself included, can train for a long period of time and do it effectively and not sacrificing, like we were discussing, our lives in the road.
Yeah, I think training wise, like you want to leave your ego at the door before you walk into the gym. I think a lot of times like we try to do too much. Um, I'm not trying to like fear monger anybody, but I mean the injuries I've gotten, it's because I was trying to do too much
Mm.
and I just didn't know my thresholds. So I think just keeping your ego in check, it's gonna might keep you a little bit on the safer side, and that kind of leads to longevity. I think respecting your rest days, in a sense like your deloads, rest days, that goes a long ways because your body will tell you when it's tired. And, if you're a hardcore bodybuilder or a bodybuilder that really is driving for progress, sometimes we ignore, those signs our body's giving us, like, hey, you need to chill out a little bit and rest up. So I really put a high value on recovery. It's an equal part of my process. The training's important, right? But so is
Sure.
the recovery, and that goes hand in hand with it. So you have to respect that. Mentally, like kind of what we've been talking about, like don't be so rigid and hardcore with how you think about it. Because you could burn out. I don't know about you, but if early on I was just so hardcore. It was 100% like go 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 with bodybuilding that I did have some moments where I did get mentally burned out and all of a sudden, I was like, instead of riding this high all the time, I was like way down here. So I was like up and down again, kind of like we talked about earlier. So I've learned to kind of balance out my emotions. Like, don't get too high when things are going really well, and don't get too low when they're not. Just try to keep myself in the middle, and that's helped me to, keep, a lot of longevity on the mental side of things. Um, let's see other things. Yeah, the last thing I would say is enjoyment. Like, just have fun with what you're doing. Like again, like you can look at the research and try to get educated and try to help your progress out. But, again, if you're trying to do something and you're having a hard time conforming to it, it's okay not to do things perfectly. It's okay to like maybe do something that might be on paper anyways, a little more suboptimal. But if it brings you more enjoyment, chances are you're going to stick with it. You'll have more motivation around it, which means you'll put more effort in and possibly, it's actually more optimal because of that. And it can actually take you a little further. So you have to kind of put enjoyment. I think enjoyment is probably like number one on my list.
Man, that's been so awesome. So, Jeff, I cannot thank you enough. It's been a super awesome discussion, more on the personal side of things, more than training variables and nutrition variables and all that. More of the life lessons that we can learn from a pro bodybuilder like yourself that's been through pretty much every side of the road, from the extreme side, from the hardcore side, from the more balanced side. So I really cannot thank you enough. It's been a huge pleasure. And in a couple of days, I'll be posting a little bit of key points in Spanish because I'm a
Okay.
Spanish speaker. And for the people that can't follow, I usually do that. So thanks again. Anytime you want to come down to Mexico, you're more than welcome.
I'm gonna tell my wife because she's gonna say next week.
When you want, man,
My
you're
wife's
more than
family's
welcome.
from Mexico, right?
From Mexico, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
right.
So So if I tell her, hey, you just said that, we'll be on a plane tomorrow.
You're more than welcome. I
I
stand by it,
appreciate
man.
that. I appreciate it.
I,
Thanks for having me. It's been an
I
honor.
appreciate your time. It's been a huge honor, and I hope you have a great rest of the day, Jeff. Great talking to you.
All right, take care.
Sure.